My own son introduced another woman as his mother, right in front of me, on the day I had sacrificed my entire life for. At 66, after years of working 3 jobs, selling the house I once called home, and breaking my body just to pay his tuition, I stood there invisible. He clasped her hand, smiled, and said with pride, "This is my mom, the one responsible for who I am today." I felt my knees weaken, but I didn't collapse. Because what I chose to do next didn't need shouting, it needed silence, silence sharp enough to scar. I wasn't born for glory. My life was built on mops, aprons, and secondhand tables. At 66, my hands bore the permanent scent of bleach from hospital hallways, the sting of grease from diner shifts, and the roughness of countless yard sales where I haggled for pennies to pay another installment on my son's tuition. My name is Margaret Hayes, and if you've ever wondered what it means to trade away your entire existence for someone else's future, then perhaps you'll understand what I'm about to tell you. When Andrew was born, I promised him a life better than mine. His father was gone before his 3rd birthday, leaving me with debts and silence. I learned to stretch $1 so thin it was nearly transparent. I clipped coupons, sewed his clothes, and never once bought myself a new pair of shoes unless the soles had split. People used to whisper, "She'll work herself to death for that boy." And they were right. By the time Andrew entered high school, I had carved my days into 3 pieces. Mornings began at the hospital, pushing carts of disinfectant and bending my spine to scrub linoleum floors. Evenings, I wore a stiff uniform and carried trays heavy enough to bow my shoulders at the diner down on Maple Street. Weekends were for the flea market, where I spread old quilts on the asphalt and sold chipped teacups, second-hand books, anything I could salvage from neighbors who didn't mind clearing out their garages for a few dollars. Every cent was a brick in the road to Andrew's dream. I didn't mind. At least, that's what I told myself. Because every night, no matter how sore my knees were or how raw my hands felt, I would picture him standing in a white coat, stethoscope around his neck, looking at me with pride. That vision was the rope I pulled myself forward with, but dreams cost more than I imagined. When the tuition letter arrived, numbers so large I had to trace them with my finger to believe them, I knew the old Hayes family house had to go. It was the place where Andrew had taken his first steps, where my grandmother's rocking chair still creaked in the corner, where the wallpaper peeled in patterns I had once called charming. I sold it without hesitation. "What good is a house," I whispered, "if it can't keep a dream alive?" We moved into a rented room above a laundromat. The walls were thin, the air always faintly metallic from steam. Andrew hated it at first. He said his classmates would think less of him. I told him to focus on his studies, that one day he'd thank me when he stood taller than anyone else in that auditorium. He didn't answer, but I kept believing. The sacrifices stacked up like unpaid bills. I stopped going to church because I was too ashamed of wearing the same faded dress. I gave up doctor visits when my chest ached, convincing myself it was just fatigue. I ate leftovers from the diner instead of cooking at home. Every time Andrew asked for money for textbooks, I handed it over with a smile, though sometimes it was my electric bill money folded into his palm. There were nights I collapsed into bed, so exhausted I forgot to eat. But even then, before my eyes closed, I whispered the same line. When he wears that white coat, it will all be worth it. People sometimes ask how a mother can give so much without expecting something in return. The truth is, we do expect something. Not money, not comfort, but recognition. We expect our children to see us, to remember who carried them when they were small, who worked until her spine curved, who sacrificed youth and health for their future. That was all I wanted, just to be seen. One winter evening, I fainted at the hospital while carrying a bucket of mop water. The nurse on duty rushed me to a chair, pressed a cold pack to my head, and asked if I had anyone to call. I shook my head. Andrew was buried in exams, and I didn't want him distracted. I told her I was fine. But as I sat there, feeling the tremor in my hands, I realized my body was breaking faster than I could mend it. Still, the tuition had to be paid, so the next morning, I tied my apron again. The day Andrew received his acceptance letter into medical school, I cried harder than I did on my wedding day. He was going to make it. All the back-breaking shifts, all the skipped meals, all the lonely nights. It was all leading here. He hugged me, quick and stiff, and said, "Thanks, Mom. You did more than anyone could." That single sentence carried me for years, but gratitude is fragile. As the semesters rolled on, his phone calls grew shorter, his visits home fewer. He said he was busy. I believed him. I didn't press. I thought distance was the price of ambition. I kept every receipt, every tuition slip, every letter from the school acknowledging my payments. I didn't know why. I suppose I wanted proof that I existed in his story. Proof that when he became a doctor, my fingerprints were there in the ink. And so I endured. Through arthritis that stiffened my fingers, through nights when my breath rattled in my chest, through mornings when my reflection looked like a stranger. I told myself, hold on until the graduation, hold on until the day the crowd applauds and he turns to say, "This is my mother. She gave me everything." That image kept me alive. But what I didn't know, what no mother ever prepares for, was that the same day I believed would crown my sacrifices would be the day I was erased from my own son's story. The morning of Andrew's graduation, I pressed the wrinkles from my one good dress until the iron hissed its last puff of steam. It was a faded navy blue, the same dress I had worn to his high school ceremony, patched twice at the hem, but still decent. I brushed my hair back into a bun and pinned a small silver brooch to my chest. My mother's, the only piece of jewelry I still owned. In my hands, I carried a modest bouquet, carnations bought at half price from the grocery store down the road. They smelled faintly of soap, not perfume, but they were the best I could give. The auditorium buzzed with music and chatter. Rows of proud parents craned their necks, snapping photos with their phones, waving as their children filed in. My heart thudded against my ribs. I sat near the back, content to be in the shadows, waiting for the moment Andrew would cross the stage and my sacrifices would finally find their light. When his name was called, I rose from my seat, clutching the flowers to my chest. He looked so tall in his cap and gown, the gold tassel swinging with each step. My throat tightened with pride. This was it. This was the moment I had carried in my mind for decades. Andrew reached the microphone, his voice steady, his smile wide. "I wouldn't be here today without my mother," he began. The words echoed through the hall, and I felt tears prick my eyes. He was about to say my name, about to show them all who had built this day. But then he turned. His hand reached for someone seated in the front row. A woman stood, elegant in a cream suit, pearls glowing at her throat. Clara. The wife my late husband had chosen after leaving me, the woman who once told me, "Margaret, sometimes love isn't enough. Money makes a real mother." Andrew's fingers intertwined with hers, and he held them high. His voice rang with conviction. "This is my mom, the woman responsible for who I am today." The bouquet slipped from my hands and fell to the floor. The carnations rolled beneath the chairs, trampled by restless feet. No one noticed. No one bent to pick them up. My son kept speaking, thanking mentors, professors, and the woman at his side. Not once did his eyes search for me in the crowd. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, as if the walls had closed in. The applause thundered around me, a sea of clapping hands and cheering voices, while I sat frozen in my seat. For a brief second, I believed it was a mistake, that he would glance my way and wave, that he would correct himself. But when his gaze swept across the auditorium, it slid right over me like I was a shadow too faint to register. He avoided me deliberately. I knew that look, averting, dismissing, as if he feared recognition, feared what would surface if someone asked about the weary woman clutching empty hands at the back of the hall. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned in, capturing the perfect shot of a successful young doctor honoring the elegant woman beside him. Each click of the shutter was another nail sealing my erasure. Clara smiled graciously, accepting the applause as though she had ever lifted a single bucket of mop water or wiped sweat from her neck after a double shift or gone hungry so someone else could eat. My knees trembled, but I stayed seated. I could not bring myself to stand, to shout, to claim what was mine. Dignity can be a prison as much as it is a shield. My dignity told me to stay silent, though silence burned worse than humiliation. A woman sitting next to me whispered, "Isn't it beautiful, the way he honors his mother?" I nodded weakly, my mouth too dry to form words. Every cheer felt like a dagger, every smile a reminder that my story had been rewritten without my consent. I was no longer the mother of a doctor. I was no one. When the ceremony ended, families rushed forward with flowers, gifts, and cameras. I bent slowly, picked up what remained of my bouquet, petals crushed, stems bent, and slipped out through the side door. My footsteps echoed down the hallway, but no one followed. Outside, the sun was too bright, the air too warm. I walked past groups of laughing graduates posing for photos. I thought I heard Andrew's voice, but I didn't turn. I couldn't. I sat on a bench across the street, clutching the ruined carnations. Their petals flaked into my lap like ashes. My body shook with the effort of holding back tears. I wanted to scream, to demand the world see me, to tell them every hour I had worked, every bone I had bent to make this day possible. But my voice stayed trapped behind my teeth. And then it happened. The moment that sealed everything. Across the street, the cameras flashed again. Andrew stood with Clara, his arm draped over her shoulder, his smile radiant. For the photographers, for the world, they looked perfect together. The lens never turned toward me. In that instant, with the light bouncing off the polished lenses, I understood. I had been erased. My existence, my sacrifices, my love, all of it had been scrubbed clean from the story. Andrew had chosen to bury me in silence, and the world was applauding the burial. The carnations slipped from my lap, scattering onto the pavement. I didn't pick them up this time. I simply sat there, staring across the street, knowing that the history of Margaret Hayes had been written out of her own son's triumph. And I realized, with a clarity so sharp it cut through the fog of pain, I had been deleted from his story long before today. Today was just the proof. That night, after the ceremony, I didn't return to the crowded streets where graduates laughed with their families. I walked past them, invisible, the wilted carnation still dangling from my hand. I didn't stop to look for Andrew. I didn't wait for him to notice I was gone. I took the bus home in silence, sitting at the back, my reflection ghost-like in the window. The city lights slid past, blurred by tears I refused to shed in public. When I reached the room above the laundromat, I placed the flowers on the small table and stared at them until the petals curled inward. I should have been screaming, should have demanded answers, but instead I sat in the dark, rocking slightly, as though if I stayed still long enough, the pain would dissolve into the walls. In the days that followed, I made a choice. I didn't tell Andrew where I was. I didn't answer the occasional call from distant relatives. I packed a single suitcase and moved out quietly, leaving no forwarding address. It was easier to disappear than to watch myself become a ghost in his life. People thought I had accepted it. They thought I had bowed to fate, resigned to being erased. Even Andrew must have believed it because he didn't come searching. To him, my silence was proof that I had stepped aside, that I had blessed his new story. But silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes silence is the only shield left. The days grew slow and heavy. I fell into a routine of small, lonely rituals. I boiled potatoes and ate them cold the next day because it wasn't worth the trouble of cooking for one. I sat by the window in the evenings holding the photograph of my late husband, the man who had left me but whose smile still carried echoes of the life we once dreamed of. I dusted the frame, whispered to him about the day, about how our boy had turned his back. I imagined he was listening. It made the nights less unbearable. Sometimes, when I heard laughter outside, I pressed my palm against the glass and closed my eyes. I pictured Andrew as a boy again, running down the street with scraped knees, calling for me. That boy was gone. The man who replaced him belonged to someone else. Life shrank into quiet details, washing dishes that barely dirtied, folding laundry too neatly because there was so little of it, filling the silence with the creak of my chair. There were no graduations to attend, no reasons to smile at strangers, only survival, thin and bare. One afternoon, as I was clearing out a drawer, I came across a worn leather notebook. The cover was cracked, its pages swollen with years of ink and receipts stuffed between them. It was my ledger, the record of every tuition payment, every note about shifts I had taken, every sacrifice I had made to keep Andrew afloat. I ran my fingers over the pages, each entry like a scar. $80 textbook fund, extra diner shift. $150 tuition installment, sold jewelry. $300 rent deferred, hospital overtime. Every line a piece of my life traded away. I held it to my chest, trembling. Proof that I hadn't imagined my sacrifices, proof that I hadn't been just a background figure. My handwriting was there, ink smudged by sweat, showing that I had lived, I had given, I had carried him. Later that week, while sitting on the porch of the small rooming house, my elderly neighbor, Mr. Lowell, shuffled over. He was a quiet man, his back bent like a question mark, his eyes watery but sharp. He noticed the notebook in my lap. "What's that you're clutching like it's made of gold?" he asked. I hesitated, then opened it. He leaned closer, squinting at the pages. His lips moved silently as he read the columns of figures, the scribbled notes about double shifts, the receipts tucked between pages. When he finally looked up, his eyes glistened. "Margaret," he whispered, "if it weren't for you, that boy would have never made it to graduation. You carried him on your back every step of the way." I swallowed hard. Hearing it out loud from someone other than myself cracked something open in me. For so long, I had lived as though my sacrifices vanished into thin air. But here they were, recorded, undeniable. Not lost, only ignored. Mr. Lowell tapped the notebook with a crooked finger. "This is your story. Don't ever let anyone tell you it isn't." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. His words echoed in my mind. My son hadn't erased me. He had chosen to bury me. But the truth was still here, in ink and paper, in memories that could not be stolen. For the first time since that terrible day, a strange calm settled over me. My existence was not defined by Andrew's recognition. My sacrifices did not need his applause to matter. They were real, and they were mine. But calm is not the same as peace. As the night stretched on, I realized something else. If I wanted to live, I couldn't keep disappearing into silence. The truth hadn't been lost, only hidden, and I needed to decide what to do with it. As dawn crept through the window, I closed the notebook and held it tight. My son might have buried me, but I was not gone. Not yet. And in that fragile light of morning, I understood. My story wasn't over. The notebook sat open on my lap, its pages like a map of scars. I traced each line with my finger, remembering where I had been when I wrote them. The $10 bill I earned from scrubbing vomit out of a hospital hallway. The $50 I got for staying 2 hours past my shift at the diner. The weekend I sold my grandmother's chair, the one I once swore I'd never part with, just to cover the next installment of Andrew's tuition. Each number was a piece of my body carved away. For a long time, I thought those sacrifices only mattered if Andrew acknowledged them, that without his recognition, they were invisible. But sitting there in the quiet, I realized something different. The proof was already written. My back carried the weight, My hands bore the calluses, and the ink on those slips of paper testified to the truth. It didn't need his approval. It had always been real. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the laundromat machines below, the steady rhythm of spinning and draining. It was oddly comforting, like a heartbeat I didn't have to strain for. For the first time in months, the silence inside me was not crushing, but spacious, as if my lungs had remembered how to expand. Still, I didn't tell anyone. I kept the notebook close, carrying it like a talisman. At night, I set it beside my bed, whispering to myself, "You mattered, Margaret. You mattered, whether he says it or not." It became my ritual, a quiet defiance against erasure. One afternoon, while I sat on the porch, the neighborhood's hum drifting around me, a young woman approached. Her name was Lila, a student from the community college nearby. I had noticed her a few times, thin and pale, carrying stacks of used textbooks. That day, she seemed more worn down than usual, her shoulders slumped under the weight of invisible burdens. "Mrs. Hayes," she said softly, Do you have any extra notebooks?" Mine fell apart. I smiled faintly and motioned to the chair beside me. "Take one from the stack inside. I keep extras." She nodded gratefully, stepping into the room. But when she returned, her eyes weren't on the empty notebooks. They were on the notebook, the leather one, lying open on the table. "I'm sorry," she stammered. I read a little. I didn't mean to pry." I opened my mouth to tell her it was private, but she was already trembling. "Mrs. Hayes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't know me, but you once gave me $20 at the bus stop when I didn't have enough to ride to class. I never forgot. I dropped out last year when I couldn't afford tuition, but seeing this..." She pressed her hand against the notebook. "You wrote it all down. Every hour you gave up, every dollar you scraped together. You lived for someone else's dream, and you still gave me enough to make it one more day." Her eyes filled with tears, and before I could move, she sank to her knees in front of me. "You're the reason I haven't quit completely. You're the reason I'm still trying." The sound that came from her throat wasn't just gratitude, it was grief, raw and aching. I reached out with trembling hands, lifting her chin so she'd look at me. Her tears blurred her vision, but I could see the truth in her gaze. She saw me. In that moment, a warmth spread through me, something I hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Not from my son, but from someone whose life I had touched, without even knowing. And suddenly, it didn't matter that Andrew had erased me from his story. My story was still alive, living in the people who had felt the weight of my small kindnesses. We sat together quietly, letting the wind carry away the heaviness. For the first time since the graduation, I felt something that resembled hope, a fragile light flickering but persistent, like a candle in a draft. Later, after she left, I sat with the notebook open once again. My hands no longer shook as I turned the pages. Instead, I felt a steady calm, a grounded certainty. My sacrifices were mine, and they would outlast denial. But even as the peace settled, a chill lingered at the edges of my thoughts. Andrew's silence wasn't benign. Clara's ambition wasn't gentle. They had rewritten my place in his life once, and people like them didn't stop at a single betrayal. I closed the notebook slowly, my heart steady but wary. I didn't yet know how, but I could feel it pressing against the horizon. Their hunger, their greed, their fear of being unmasked. My story wasn't finished. It had only shifted. And somewhere in the shadows, the next wound was already waiting. The day I left the room above the laundromat, I carried only 2 suitcases and the notebook. The city had become a place of shadows for me, every corner echoing with the memory of my erasure. I boarded a bus heading south, watching the landscape unravel into rolling hills and sleepy towns where no one knew my name. I wanted a place where the silence didn't feel like exile, but like freedom. I found it in a riverside town where the streets were lined with oak trees and the air smelled faintly of roasted beans from the old mill. A small vacant shop sat on the corner of Main Street, its windows dusty, its floorboards worn. To anyone else, it looked tired. To me, it looked like possibility. I rented it with what savings I had left. With my own hands, I scrubbed the walls, painted them a soft cream, and lined shelves with second-hand chairs and mismatched tables. From the boxes I had carried all these years, I unpacked the medical textbooks Andrew once used, each one bought with my wages and my health. They filled a whole wall, their spines cracked, but dignified. Above them, I hung a simple sign, Second Breath Cafe. The first customers were hesitant, curious about the old woman brewing coffee behind the counter, but soon word spread that the cafe was more than a place to drink. It became a refuge for students who couldn't afford much, coffee for $1, free refills if they were studying. Sometimes I let them borrow the textbooks. Sometimes I just listened. They started calling me Mom Hayes. At first I laughed, embarrassed, but the name stuck, echoing through the cafe until it became my new identity. Not Andrew's mother, not the woman who raised, just Mom Hayes, the woman who kept the lights on late for students too tired to go home, who knew how to brew coffee strong enough to hold up a dream. I would sit behind the counter in the evenings, watching groups of students huddled over notes, their laughter spilling across the room. It warmed me in a way I hadn't expected, a rhythm of life that asked nothing from me, but gave everything in return. Then one afternoon, a young journalist wandered in. He ordered a coffee, noticed the shelves of medical books, and asked about them. I told him they once belonged to a student who had become a doctor. I didn't say his name. The reporter lingered, fascinated by the story of an elderly woman who turned her sacrifices into a haven for struggling students. He scribbled notes, snapped a photo of the shelves, and left with a promise. People need to hear about this. A week later, an article appeared in the local paper, The Silent Mother of Medicine. It painted me as a quiet hero, a woman who had poured her life into supporting education, now giving back through her cafe. The story spread beyond the town, shared online, whispered about in nearby colleges. Students began arriving from farther away, eager to meet the woman in the article. I read the piece once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into the notebook. It was flattering, but it didn't change who I was. I didn't bask in the praise. I brewed another pot of coffee, wiped down the tables, and listened to the hum of voices. My silence was intact. I never mentioned Andrew. His name stayed locked behind my ribs. The cafe blossomed into something I hadn't expected. Strangers became regulars. Students brought me small gifts, dried flowers, handmade bookmarks, sketches of the cafe. Laughter became the music of my days, soft and healing. In the mornings, the sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes that danced like confetti. At night, the place glowed with warmth, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. There was peace in the routine, in the steady rhythm of pouring coffee and sharing quiet wisdom. Some evenings I sat with the students, telling them stories of resilience, of surviving long nights when the world seemed indifferent. Their eyes shone with recognition, as if they saw themselves in me, and perhaps they did. It felt like a rebirth, one without fanfare, one built on quiet breaths rather than applause. Each smile, each thank you, each moment of belonging stitched the torn fabric of my life back together. I no longer needed Andrew's recognition. I had found a community that saw me as I was. But peace has a way of drawing storms. One evening, the cafe was crowded with students revising for finals, their voices overlapping in a soft chorus. I moved among them, refilling cups, gathering plates, basking in the glow of their presence. Then the door opened and the bell above it chimed. I looked up, and there he was. Andrew. He stood in the doorway, still tall, still polished, but his eyes were not proud. They were wide, frantic, as if chased by something he couldn't outrun. For a moment, the cafe fell into silence, every head turning toward him. My breath caught, the cup in my hand trembling. His gaze swept the room, landing on me, and in that instant I knew the truth he had buried so deeply was clawing its way to the surface. The bell above the cafe door was still swaying when Andrew stepped inside. The warmth of chatter died down, replaced by a tense stillness that spread through the room. Students lowered their voices, their eyes darting between me and the man who had just entered. He looked polished, as always, tailored suit, polished shoes, but his face betrayed him. His jaw was tight, his eyes restless. He wasn't here with pride. He was here with fear. I set down the cup I was holding and wiped my hands on my apron, steadying myself. "Andrew," I said, my voice even, neither tender nor cruel. He approached slowly, as though each step weighed more than the last. When he finally reached the counter, he leaned close, his whisper sharp. "I read the article. Clara read it too. She's terrified." I met his eyes, waiting. He swallowed hard, lowering his voice further. "You have to stop this. Take it down. Deny it if anyone asks. Clara says this could ruin us. People are starting to ask questions. They're wondering why they've never seen you." It struck me then. He wasn't here to apologize, not to acknowledge me, not to reclaim me as his mother. He was here to protect himself, to protect the life he had built on borrowed glory. His plea wasn't born of love. It was born of panic. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small box I had prepared long ago. Inside were the receipts, the tuition slips, the overtime pay stubs, the ledger filled with years of sacrifice, and on top, the newspaper article that had sparked all of this. I slid the box across the counter. "The truth is already written, Andrew. It was written long before that reporter came. Whether I speak or stay silent, it exists." He opened the box with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the documents, and I saw his face crumble. The receipts with my signature. The tuition stubs naming me as guarantor. The endless notes of hours worked. His fingers lingered on the ink, as if touching them burned. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling before he could stop them. "Mom." His voice cracked, a sound that once would have broken me, but now only hollowed the space between us. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought it was easier if everyone just—" He trailed off, unable to finish. The cafe had grown silent. Students who had once been buried in their notes were now watching, their gazes heavy with judgment and loyalty. One by one, their voices rose, calling softly, firmly, "Mom Hayes!" The name filled the air like a chant, each repetition anchoring me more firmly where I stood. Andrew turned, startled by their voices. He looked around the cafe, his expression tightening as he realized the truth. He no longer owned the narrative. He was no longer the center. The people here knew who I was. They had claimed me as their own. For the first time, Andrew looked small. I stepped out from behind the counter, my apron still dusted with flour. I placed a hand on the box and gently closed the lid. "You came here to keep me silent. But silence isn't mine anymore. It belongs to the past. I have nothing to hide." He shook his head, tears dripping onto the wood floor. "Please, if people find out—" "They already know," I said simply. There was no anger in my voice, no triumph, no venom, just the truth, steady and unshakable. Andrew's shoulders sagged. He stood there surrounded by young faces that reflected everything he had chosen to ignore. Loyalty, gratitude, recognition freely given. He had none of it. Not anymore. I turned to the students, their eyes shining with quiet defiance, and offered them a small smile. "Let's get back to work," I said softly. Their laughter and chatter rose again, a current that pushed him further into the margins. Andrew remained rooted, his tears unnoticed, his presence no longer commanding. He had become the outsider in the very place where I had found belonging. I picked up the box and carried it to the back room. When I returned, he was still there, pale and trembling. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw regret, desperation, and shame twisted into one. I gave him a single gentle smile, not forgiveness, not invitation, simply acknowledgement. Then I turned away, wiping a table, refilling a cup, returning to the life I had built. He didn't follow me. When he finally left, the bell above the door chimed again, softer this time, almost mournful. The students lifted their heads, watching me, waiting. And when they saw me smile, they smiled too. I had no need for revenge, no hunger for recognition. My victory was quieter, deeper, the peace of knowing who I was, even when the world tried to erase me. The night closed around the cafe, warm and alive. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. If you were me standing in my shoes, watching your son crumble in the ruins of his own ambition, would you forgive him, or would you let him live forever with the weight of his silence? The answer isn't mine alone. It belongs to you.